Good evening to everybody and a very, very warm welcome to PAS 2017 annual lecture. As most of you will know, PAS stages a lecture every November and a discussion panel every May. This year, I know one has to say that, but in this case it is really true that we are particularly delighted to, yes, you can laugh, Conor, to have secured Conor Gearty contribution. We are delighted because it's very, very hard for Conor, who is so busy, to be able to identify a day in his calendar. But I must say personally, I'm a regular and avid attendee of his public lectures at the LSE, which are always run to raucous applause. So we have something to emulate, I'm afraid. Before Conor speaks, we will have the joint managing solicitors of PAS, Lubia Begum-Rob and Deborah Russo, who will have to give you fantastically some good news about PAS recent achievements and successes. Then Conor will be speaking. Then we will have a Q&A that I think Deborah is going to manage. And then you will have, therefore, a chance to speak. And then we will say thank you to everybody. So there you are. I leave them to the important things.
Good evening. Look at me tiptoeing. It's really wonderful to see so many people here. I'm Lubia Begum-Rob. I'm one of the joint managing solicitors at PAS, and usually I have a job share with Deborah. My role this evening is to take advantage of the magic of Conor when it comes to drawing in lots and lots and lots of people. This time in order to share some good news. You don't get a lot of good news in prison law. And this evening, you're going to get not one, not two, but three. Conor is the first one. The second one is that we're officially launching our self-help toolkits. These have been a few years in the making. They're kindly funded by the Legal Education Foundation. We wrote and designed these to help prisoners undertake some legal processes themselves when the government cut 80% of prison law funding out from under our feet, despite months and thousands of pages of consultation. They look like this. I'm told they're fantastic. I'm sick to death of looking at them. But it's not as good as a legal aid lawyer, but I think it's pretty good, although it's all been produced by legal aid lawyers. So we'll hope you'll take a look at them outside. They're going to be converted into easy read so that as many people as possible within the prison, including those with low literacy levels, can benefit from them. We've got 10 self-help toolkits already, and we've got some of our corporate partners, some of whom are here this evening, who are going to help us make some more. So this is our self-help toolkits project. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand you over to Deborah, who's going to share even better big news.
Good evening. As Lubia just said, we have more good news to share tonight in that the government have officially withdrawn their Supreme Court application to appeal the decision of the Court of Appeal of April this year, which is great news. And PAS... I also want to take the opportunity to thank immensely Simon Crichton, who's here tonight. And it's thanks to his hard work that we've managed to achieve this. PAS and the Howard League have written to the Lord Chancellor today, urging him to reinstate legal aid in the three areas in which the Court of Appeal found in our favour, namely pre-tariff reviews for indeterminate sentence prisoners, categorisation reviews for Category A prisoners, and the placement of prisoners in close supervision centres. The above constitute a very small area of public spend, and we therefore hope the Lord Chancellor will reinstate legal aid as it was pre-cuts. Together with the Howard League, we will closely monitor how the government honours its commitment to abide by the judgment. Now back to this evening. It is my role tonight to introduce you to our outstanding speaker, Conor Gearty, We have the highest number of attendees ever at our annual lecture this year, which is proof to show just how popular and well regarded he is. As an LLM student at King's College back in 1998, he was one of those inspirational human rights figures I admired the most. A leading academic authority in human rights, Conor was a founder member of Matrix Chambers and is currently a professor of human rights law and director of LSE's Institute of Public Affairs at the London School of Economics, where he was also, for 7 years, director of the Centre for the Study of Human Rights, an interdisciplinary research centre. Tonight's lecture is entitled Prisons, A Life Without Human Rights. After the lecture, Conor will take some questions from the floor. Now, over to you, Conor.
That's a very good point. What about that tone of voice? Does that work? I don't mind shouting, but these people are already looking anxious. It's fixed. The microphone's not the event. So we can take that away. I quite like this as a speaking challenge. Every now and again to remember the need to express. It's not a solution for me to walk over there, because there'll be a whole lot of people here who will be complaining. Are you sure? Because it's not a solution to be in the middle, because there's apparently a camera. And there are, I assume, people in places all around Britain watching this, because I've never before been intimidated by myself. Because normally what happens is there's one or two really good people ahead of you and you hope they're hopeless. And they're quite good and you feel, bloody hell, that was good. But it's me. It's me. I'm following myself, apparently. You're all here because of me. Deborah spent the 90s stalking me at King. Martine, when I came in, fully briefed by my picture, came over to me pretending she'd attended numerous lectures at LSE by me, a lie she repeated this evening. So I'm intimidated by myself. I also met somebody, I don't know where you are, the person from Sheffield. I may have made a mistake, but I thought you said, there you are. Did you say I've come all the way from Sheffield for a few jokes? No. Oh, thank God for that. Thank God. It was Jill and Elaine who said they were going to leave if there were no jokes. You're here for a serious presentation, so that's good. That's good. But I think your premises here at PASS are fantastic. I think it's a great thing. It's a great thing that an organisation like this has done so well out of legal aid and are celebrating in the right way this great victory. And that's my oblique way of acknowledging, in the absence of activists, Mr. Mayor and Ms. Mayor and Mr. Brown and Ms. Brown, to acknowledge their involvement in this as well, whoever they are. I mean, these buildings, to me, all merge into one. They have this phantom address, and then they all look alike, and you look eventually for a place which has a 95th floor and find a room like this. But I know we wouldn't be where we are today, specifically here, without them. So I think that's great. I think that's great. And whoever, if they're here, great, thank you, thank you. And there's a bucket. I don't know if you know, the bucket's very traditional. There's a bucket outside. There's a bucket outside. And you're not able to put your credit card into the bucket or your Bitcoin. It's extremely traditional. You're supposed to have, I think, what's still called money. And so no doubt there'll be opportunities for Mayor and Brown to contribute into the bucket. And for the rest of us too. But I gather there's going to be some pitch later on. I'm not being paid, by the way. This bucket is not designed to cover my lavish fee. I'm going to talk a little bit, prisoners, a life without human, which is inverted commas. Is it there? Yeah. It's in brackets. Rights. I want to approach the subject in a sort of, in a way that is evoking the memories of the 1980s and 90s, and I'm going to talk about prisons and human rights, but I'm going to try and build a story about where we're going generally in human rights and how prisons is, I think actually, for discussion maybe later, more even than refugees, a driver of this field. And the field that it drives is a field that combines human rights with common law rights. And that's why this human is usefully in brackets, because we have got a tradition here in this country, which is 40, 50 years old, of growing procedural rights through the courts within the prison system, which predates the Human Rights Act. And the human rights thing has given a great lift to it and has pushed it into new arenas. So I want to speculate about the future through the route of the prison's engagement with rights in the present. Can you all hear me over there? Still going okay? Excellent. I can't see any of you. It was vague waves. We've heard about this really interesting concession with regard to the case, the Howard League case and your case. Great win. And we have a new, whatever they're called, Lord Chancellor, Minister for Justice. And it's quite significant, I think, they've withdrawn that. And we have had two other interesting bits of prison-related news in the courts in the last few days, which I should start with. But I'll start with it against that background I identified of having a regard for the 1970s and 80s and the strong belief then that human rights were not valuable if you were from the left perspective. I mention that because we're going to come back to it. I was a skeptic about human rights in the 1980s and early 90s. If Deborah had really attended my classes, she'd know that. She'd be doing sensible subjects with my colleague Keith Ewing, as was mainstream left opinion. And whereas that may be thought to be of historical interest, I think it could be of interest for tomorrow as well, because we're in a very peculiar political position in this country. And we have both opportunities and pitfalls for rebuilding and renewing the rights agenda, with prisoners maybe in the vanguard. The cases I'm referring to are firstly the Hearst case. And you will have seen, I'm sure, the statements by David Lillington announcing the government's intention to make a move in the direction of the demands made in the Hearst case with regard to prisoner voting. The moves are minute, as you may have noticed. As reported in The Guardian, I haven't seen the full statement, it seems to cover a very, very small number of prisoners. And they may even not be incarcerated at the moment of their vote. But this is a very significant point because it is the Hearst case, 2005, the prisoner who had been convicted of manslaughter, who had established a breach of his right to vote, which case is the one that has driven the human rights skepticism of the last 10 years. I think I'll say that with total certainty. The political figures involved were, that is, the figures who reacted to this case in the European Court of Human Rights, were essentially strongly Eurosceptic. And the leader of them was, as you may know, David Davis. Now, I declare an interest. David Davis is a fellow of the Institute of Public Affairs, and I've known him well and debated with him on human rights. And I have, therefore, from him the knowledge of the way in which he deployed the Hearst case in order to destabilize the European Convention in Britain and the European Court of Human Rights in particular. And, of course, as you may know, the House of Commons, acting on the advice not only of David Davis but of Jack Straw, voted overwhelmingly to maintain the inflexible ban on prisoner voting, and it looked like a complete impasse, with the European Court of Human Rights confirming its position that there was a breach of rights where there was an inflexible ban, and the British having erected this into a position so principled that they were contemplating, if we remember Theresa May's one speech before the referendum on Europe, they were contemplating leaving the Council of Europe rather than conceding the Hearst case. The papers were hysterical about it, and it looked as though civilization would end if there were any concession to the nefarious foreigners. Sometimes it's important to notice what doesn't happen as well as what does. This concession is, in my view, a testing of the waters by government about the extent to which conceding European positions under the human rights umbrella will excite the animosity of their UKIP support base. I use the term UKIP loosely now to describe the Conservative Party and its backers in the popular press. I have to be careful because the number 3 chief whip in the Conservative Party wants to have PowerPoints where one mentions Brexit. And my solution is not to mention Brexit and to avoid him. But I can't go too far or I'll have to send him the speech. He may be hunkered down in the whip's office. He may be hunkered down in the whip's office watching this at the moment as part of the research he's doing for his excellent book. There has been very little reaction at all. There has not been hysteria. What was hysterically to be denounced 2 years ago has been barely noticed. The Mail, the Express and so on continue to run their stories about celebrities one hasn't heard of and medical conditions one didn't know exist. It's astonishing how little it's provoked anything. This is a straw in the wind. And the wind of which it is a straw is the gradual dawning realization in Britain that the attacks on the convention had been merely proxy attacks for the attack it was thought was unthinkable, which was on the European Union. And not only has that attack been mounted, it's been successful. And as the disaster that is departure from the European Union becomes more and more apparent, so the energy for a fight has gone out of the UKIP types like air leaving a balloon. They are not got the capacity for venomous hatred in this field that they used to have, because they're using it all up, criticizing people on the basis of the people's status or expertise, rather than on the basis of their assertions in the field of Brexit. So it's very significant news, and I expect it to be followed by more of the same type. The second interesting case, more research it might be thought, is the case just decided by the United Kingdom Supreme Court, Brown and the Parole Board of Scotland, 1st of November 2017. This case is picking up on a long-running dispute with the European Court of Human Rights, and it originates in the case of James. It's a case I set for all the students that I teach human rights law to, because it's a case in which the senior court in the United Kingdom, I think it might then have been just about the Supreme Court or the House of Lords, Supreme Court I think, refused to challenge on human rights grounds the extraordinary Kafkaesque or catch-22 choose your popular cliché situation where people who found themselves suffering indeterminate incarceration after their tariff had been met were unable to escape it because they were required to prove rehabilitation, and the mechanisms for them to establish it were denied them through the lack of resources. And so while they could apply for parole, and there was a magnificently fair proceeding, they were incapable of establishing they could have gone to the training courses because they weren't available. Disgraceful. I thought at the time it was one of the most disgraceful judgments that the House of Lords, if it was the House of Lords Supreme Court, gave, because they concentrated on the particularities of the parole board hearing and not on the broader issue. Thank goodness for the European Court of Human Rights. James went to the European Court, may have been one of your cases, I don't know, and established that where there was no real opportunity for rehabilitation, and in the absence of it being provided, this amounted to a breach of the right to liberty guarantee in Article 5.1. It wasn't just fulfilled by a lampoonable procedure before a parole board incapable of doing justice. Now, the reaction to the case was, in Britain, among the judges, they didn't like it. They were petrified that the outcome would be the automatic release of these so-called dangerous people. The driving force in James and in Khayyam, which came afterwards, was this fear that if they took the honourable position, by which I mean applied the European Convention law, they would find themselves once again tabloid fodder. More on that in a moment, but it's an example of the courts being scared, in my opinion. And the European Court of Human Rights repeated its position in Khayyam. And there is something magnificent about the certainty with which the court has approached this issue, in my opinion. And in Brown and the Parole Board of Scotland, the Supreme Court, albeit on a different system, but detention beyond the tariff, has decided to follow it. And suddenly all the fears about immediate release have disappeared, and there are other ways in which these rehabilitative obligations can be secured without release, and the consistent line of authority from Strasbourg has been accepted. And so it's become a very important precedent. Now, here we have the European Court of Human Rights intervening on behalf of deeply unpopular prisoners, the interventions being greeted with political, in the case of Hearst, hostility, though I pause to say the Hearst equivalent case never got past the Division of Court in this country before it got to Hearst in the European Court of Human Rights. The British judges dodged that one. And in the case of James, judicial antagonism. And each has come through. And so sticking to the position of principle looks in these two cases, in the light of the last week's events, to have paid off. And that's very good news indeed. We'll get to possible risks shortly. How long have I been going on for? I'm on page 1 of a 74-page paper. I mean, there's a risk here. It's 6 minutes past 7. Are you promised drinks? Is the man leaving at 25 past 7? We just keep an eye on that. This lot over here are getting thirsty. We know they're valuable. So I will push ahead. I finish at 25 past 7. But I wanted to take a point and make a point I alluded to at the start, which is about the relationship between the common law and human rights. And in many ways, though you may not feel it, the complementarity has paid dividends in the last 20 years. This is now not the case about the decisions I've just set out, but it is the case with regard to quite a lot of others. And I want to identify in particular 4 areas. So my central point is that the common law has been mindful of procedural safeguards being important, but the human rights law has added an imaginative dimension that the common law would not have been able on its own to conjure up. So I'm arguing complementarity, so that the life with human rights has been better than the life with common law rights, but the life with common law rights is not to be sneezed at. There is a background here. And this could become important if, contrary to what I said at the start, and more on this right at the end, if there were to be a repeal of the Human Rights Act. I doubt it'll happen, by the way. I don't think the Conservatives will be in power after the next general election. But if there were to be, this could become quite important. The 4 areas, firstly, the common law fitting very well is the area of due process, obviously, due process. Those of us who learnt our public law in the late 1970s and early 1980s remember how much public law was formed by due process prisoners' cases, where the record's all there. Board of Visitors for Hull ex parte Germain is the one I remembered when I was writing this up, and so many after that, imposing standards of what we might then have called natural justice in various points of decision making in the prison system. In that case, the boards of visitors, disciplinary decisions being subject to judicial review. And matching that, the famous case of Golder in the United Kingdom, 1974, astonishing case, where Golder is able to get to Strasbourg in order to argue that not being able to get to court in Britain is a breach of his rights. And it's one of those amazing, I looked at all the preliminary documentation. There might be somebody here who knows the answer. It's an astonishing thing that Golder was able to get to Strasbourg when he couldn't get to the Strand. Well, he did. And the Article 6.1 right of access to a court was born. So there was complementarity on process. And the Human Rights Act has pushed that along. One of the most important cases under the Human Rights Act, as you will know, I'm sure, is Daly, one of the very early cases, Daly and the Secretary of State for the Home Department, about searching prison cells, and it produces one of the most important dicta on the Human Rights Act by Lord Steyn about proportionality and about the importance of the new way of thinking. But less regarded but equally significant is Lord Bingham's judgment in that case, which roots it in the common law. So there's a complementarity. Sometimes, anticipated by what I said a moment ago, the human rights law is able to do stuff that the common law would not have been able to do. Cases where it would be difficult to say of a ministerial or a governor's decision that it was manifestly unreasonable, or whatever the Thames side or Wednesbury test is, but that it becomes more possible to say it's not proportionate. One case that struck me right early on was the case concerning the taking away of a child from a female prisoner who had given birth to the child. And there was an invariable rule that the child be removed, I think it was after 18 months. And a strong court of appeal, by which I mean one that you wouldn't feel would be naturally disposed to this, saw the justice in allowing the mother to be able to put a case to the governor about why the child should not be removed from her in these particular circumstances she found herself in. I think that was a really important human rights intervention, which was really a natural justice one, but which I think it would have been difficult for the common law to have achieved on its own. So the procedure has 2 parents, common law and human rights. And without having seen what the minister said, the Howard League case, of course, is the huge issue about the Airy type arguments about financial resources being allowed to assert rights makes that a very significant case, James-like. But the Human Rights Act has definitely gone further, I think. I doubt we'd have had as much on inquiries where there is death in prison without the Human Rights Act. We did have some. We had the tragic case of Zaid Mubarak, which anticipates the human rights law. But we had, after the enactment of the Human Rights Act in 1998 and then coming into force in 2000, we have had a terrific Article 2 jurisprudence which has extended into genuine, serious inquiries into both suicides and killings in prison as a matter of course, but also in the case of JL, even a near suicide, where it's obviously not going to be an inquest, but it's going to be something high level where there's been some terrible disaster. And I think, without knowing enough about the practice, that must be a kind of engine for securing levels of accountability within the prison system. We've had strong jurisprudence from the European Court of Human Rights on both, thirdly, ill treatment and fourthly, overcrowding. On ill treatment, picking at random, and to make a point in a moment about it, a case called Torino and Rene, just recent, came across it the other day, 26th of October 2017, CIRINO, and the respondent state is Italy, and the treatment of these people in prison is absolutely shocking. Repeated physical violence for 19 days, injuries, fractured ribs, widespread bruising, physical abuse all hours of the day and night for many consecutive days, material deprivations, food, water, clothing, limited or no access to sanitary facilities, and moreover, the European Court of Human Rights goes on, in this case, Torino, quote, a broader pattern of abuse in the correctional facility at issue, which the lower court, and the court agreed with it, it labelled a generalised practice of ill treatment. Now, significantly, in this case, the European Court of Human Rights found unanimously a violation of Article 3, a right not to be tortured or subjected to inhuman or degrading treatment and punishment. And they found it in both its substantive aspect and its procedural aspect. So they found on the procedural aspect, as some of you may know, there is a duty of investigation analogous to that to be found in Article 2, and they found a breach there too, in that there was both the violence and there was the lack of proper accountability for those who had done the violent acts. Now, I don't think the common law could have generated such a robust jurisdiction without the notion of rights. And what's significant is that the European Court of Human Rights has consciously expanded the breadth and range of torture, inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment. And in doing so, they are imposing duties on the state, more on this in a moment, duties on the state to act which are thought to be more demanding of immediate response than breaches of other articles. It's a calculated escalation. And on the same vein of ill treatment, they're very alive to the risks of disappearance into prison systems, lack of inspection, and they produced the remarkable decision of Al-Nashiri in Poland, relatively recent, 24th of July 2014, which is the case where they actually called out Poland on the CIA black sites for breach of Article 3. They couldn't go for the United States, but they went for Poland, and they produced an outcome. So on ill treatment, I think the Convention and the human in the rights has empowered judicial engagement in a way that would not have been possible under the common law system, in my opinion. The final of the fourth areas, after procedural fairness, the right to life, ill treatment, is overcrowding. Overcrowding is obviously a crucial problem in prisons, and a rather sad case of the 5th of October 2017 gives you a sense of how the court approaches it. They've developed some benchmarks of the acceptable, and in this case, a reduced personal space made available to the applicant in prison ranging from 3.9 to 3.28 square metres for a period of almost 2 years was a violation of Article 8 of the Convention, of Article 3 of the Convention, and another of the applicants in that case had been restricted to 2.74 square metres of personal space for a long period of time. And they found in that case too a violation, a presumed violation of Article 3. The prolonged period of time was over 12 months. So here we have a court. This case is ABELE. The applicant was deaf and mute since birth, and his knowledge of sign language was poor. So you can just imagine what that case entailed for that individual. You can just imagine. And the breach is found unanimously. And these are efforts by the European Court of Human Rights to create minimum standards of good behaviour towards prisoners across Europe. And in doing it, they are seeking to play the cards that they have, that other enforcement bodies do not, bodies that are specialist in seeking to reduce the implications of such overcrowding and such physical violence for the dignity of prisoners. One thinks, obviously, of the bodies that are empowered to act with regard to torture specifically. And the cards they have, as we all know, are that they have this reach through the judicial branch immediately into the country. And they have consciously, in a way that I applaud, expanded the language of the Convention to reach. But now on this penultimate part of my talk, there is the issue of enforcement. And in the universities, to which I mainly belong, though I am obviously also at Matrix, there is very little engagement in mainstream legal work with what happens after cases. And it seems to me, for us academics, it's where we can learn from others who are closer, as it were. And is the judicial intervention effective? Does it make a difference? Now, as we know, with the Hearst case, it appears eventually to have made a difference. And maybe, at a certain point in the future, prisoners will be voting, which will mean that ministers will have to respond to MPs who have constituents who are in prison. It's a very important point. So maybe it does work. But what happens with these cases? The answer with regard to the cases I've described is very large damages awards are made. €80,000, €100,000, so quite high, quite high. So there is an immediate obligation on the part of the state to meet that together with costs. Do they go further? Well, here we have a problem, which is that implementation is dependent on the Committee of Ministers, and the Committee of Ministers is a political body. Now, that shouldn't be a problem in itself, but it becomes one where you can detect a shift in society away from the assumptions that underpin the human rights framework that is productive of the judgments. So what I mean by that is where there is, broadly speaking, a critical mass of engaged states that are committed in the abstract to the principles of the European Convention, then there is high-level pressure on all members of that family of European states to treat seriously the decisions of the court. So implementation flows. And one of the, I was going to say tragic, which is too big a word, if one were British, one of the enormously sad aspects of the country's current implosion is that it used to be the driver of implementation and was immensely proud of its record of implementation, or at very least of engagement with the outcomes of these cases. And because of the country's reputation, etc., abroad, this mattered. And yet, in order to attack a Europe that it was afraid to challenge at the time, the Hearst case turned on its head British engagement with the Council of Europe. And behind Britain, other countries have, of course, moved into the same space. And so there is the possibility of essentially a time lag between the court's implementation of the document and the moving perceptions of what the public interest involves on the part of legislators and executives in Europe. And this would be extremely disturbing. And what I mean, in fact, is that if the European framework were to lurch into populist rejection of human rights, and we know that certain countries which are parties to the Council of Europe have explicitly developed personalities that are prioritizing local people over others and that are quick to scapegoat the different, then if that were to become a normal understanding of what society is entitled to expect, you would continue to have the European Court of Human Rights, but its judgments would be increasingly like blank shots fired in the name of an ethic that has been forgotten. And one of the really shocking things is that if that were successful, if Europe were to be reshaped in that way, prioritizing persons on the basis of their nationhood, or on the basis of their perceived behavior, or on the basis of their gender, or sexual orientation, or whatever it is, Britain would have been one of the countries that had led the way in driving this wedge into Europe by the language that accompanied its departure or planned departure from the European Union. Now, the European Court of Human Rights is, of course, aware of this. And there is a risk here. And the risk is that the European Court of Human Rights modifies its engagement with rights to avoid the difficulties that flow from the mismatch between the two branches, executive and legislative, scattered around Europe, mediated through criticism from the Committee of Ministers, and the judicial branch. And we see, under the direction of ministers, new ideas creeping in, like subsidiarity and a renewed interest in margins of appreciation. We have yet to see it, in my opinion, in the arena of torture, where the language is being diluted to accommodate states and where outcomes are not as they are now in order to avoid battles later. We're not seeing that. But we have seen it in some cases. We have seen it. A shocking indication of where things might go is the case in which the European Court of Human Rights upheld the the ban on certain kind of head coverings in France, SAS in France, on the basis of a new aim that they invented, which warranted the restriction on the rights of the women who had been prevented from dressing as they wished. The new aim being the need to get along with each other. And this is quite a worrying thing, and I want to throw something out before I conclude. And the thing I want to throw out before I conclude is this. We are very familiar in the world of human rights to the notion of the Convention on Human Rights being a living instrument. And we have been able to avail of that in regards, for example, the cases on torture and detention and violence and overcrowding to which I've earlier referred. Our assumption with the living instrument, which has also delivered rights that gay men and women have been able to enjoy, and civil partnerships for gay people and various other advances. Our assumption has been that living instrument is all one way, in the direction of expansion of rights, in the direction of a broader rights engagement. Living instrument could conceivably work in two ways. It could work to reduce rights as well as to increase them. Living instrument is neutral as to the life that it takes, and it could take that life from a snarling change in our society just as much as it could from another. And the other ominous emerging element in this to look for and to be careful about is consensus. Now, consensus has been very important to drive the convention in certain strong directions. Had it not been for an emphasis on consensus, some of the countries that have been holdouts against gay rights might have been able to survive, but they were up against a consensus of European opinion which drove the change. But consensus depends on an assumption about there being a sufficiently, using the word loosely, liberal set of governments in Europe to ensure the consensus holds. A nightmare would be a consensus in favour of the necessary evil of torture. A nightmare would be the consensus in favour of the need to act to favour the local people. And we've toyed with the possibility of major states being led by people who would try and forge a new consensus along those lines. Which takes me, finally, back to Labour, back to the Human Rights Act, and to the extraordinary similarities, in my view, between today and the early to mid-1990s. And I'm talking now about politics, but human rights plays a part in it. The Conservative government elected in 1992, with John Major as Prime Minister, lost all moral authority within about 6 months. And it limped along for 5 years, surrounded, for those of you who have long memories, by a back-to-basics debacle, and everyone knew they were going to lose, and they lost. And they lost to Labour in 1997. Now, the current Conservative administration has won an election recently, but in winning it lost. A little bit like the Labour administration of 1950, actually. It won, but doesn't know it won, and has no ability to govern. And it's even worse than it was with Mr. Major, because there is not even the modicum of cabinet loyalty. So it's limping on. And something very interesting has happened. And the something very interesting that has happened is that Mr. Jeremy Corbyn is now being taken very seriously and behaves like somebody who wants to be taken seriously. I don't know if any of you caught sight of the dapper individual festooned with remembrance poppies who bound to the CBI podium yesterday to excoriate the government for whatever it was the CBI wanted them excoriated for. This was a different man than the one that many of us remember from the 1980s. Now, the final take-home point for me is, how can we insert a human rights agenda into a labour movement which looks as though it's about to take power. It could take power next year, it could take power the year following. I have this feeling that the electorate's revenge on the Conservative Party for Brexit is going to be frightening to behold, and it'll be the Labour Party that will be the beneficiaries. Mr. Corbyn has got this astonishingly brilliant record on immigration, prisoners, extraordinary. We are so fortunate in this country that the leader of the mainstream opposition party does not jump on atrocity to peddle the latest populist guff. That is an incredible opportunity. And so what we need to do to protect prisoners, but the wider community, is to get the Labour Party to see the language of rights as instrumentally valuable in asserting the credibility of their governing claim. This is as it always was. In 1945, the Labour administration joined the Council of Europe and signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights, despite the opposition of left-wing socialists that this was a liberal move to scupper radicalism. Harold Wilson, the next Labour Prime Minister, allowed individual petition to the Strasbourg Court in 1966 in order to show that the socialist agenda was vulnerable to challenge by individuals, including those asserting their right to property, in an international court. And Mr. Tony Blair, likewise, though certain to win, embraced the language of rights in order to provide the assurance that though Labour remained a democratic socialist party, it was not a party that would frighten the horses. Now, I think we're at that moment in the current political cycle. And if we can secure a broad understanding of rights, it could be the organising idea behind an emerging Labour administration. But for it to be that, Labour has to, this is a difficult thing to say, has to give up on some aspects of the 1970s agenda, which caused Mr. Corbyn, possibly me in the 90s certainly, to be hostile to human rights. Because human rights will constrain government in the field of property, in the field of regulation, just as they will constrain government in the field of poverty and in the field of equality. Constrain it positively in the latter two, not so well in the first two. But if we can secure a broadly based agenda on the part of the Labour Party to rights, it will embrace economic rights and social rights, and it will not scapegoat prisoners, and it will not scapegoat asylum seekers. And though the country will face extraordinary challenges after Brexit, if Brexit goes through, it could be the kind of social glue that is needed. And the prisons area will have been in the van of that, and will, though I end on this more general point, be a beneficiary. Thank you very much.
This seems to work, I think.
Oh, yeah. Over to you, I think, Deborah. Is that right?
Thank you very much, Conor. That was a great speech and lecture for us. Any questions from the floor for Conor?
Or observations, I mean, just.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll pass you the mic, if you could give us your name and where you're from.
Thank you. Professor, my name's Adrian Lower. First of all, thank you very much for an absolutely fantastic address this evening. Can I first of all declare a couple of interests? The first is the that when I was a law student in the late 80s, early 90s, I read a book of yours called Freedom Under Thatcher. And one of my housemates came across me reading this book one day, and he was good at the quantitative, but perhaps not so good at the qualitative. But he recognized that the book lasted about 250 pages, and he said to me, "Is that all we've got?" And that, if more than anything else, inspired me to become the lawyer I am. So thank you. The second declaration of interest I have to make is that I'm a judge and I'm an independent adjudicator who deals with prison adjudications. In other words, prisoners who are serving time in various prisons around the country who are accused of breaching prison rules, who sometimes, not always, have the benefit of legal advice, adjudications that are not held in public, they're dealt with in prisons. The reason that these cases refer to me and my colleagues who deal with prison adjudications is because, as a result of one of the human rights cases that you've mentioned, the power of the governor to award additional days imprisonment to prisoners has been quite rightly taken away from the governor on the basis that why should the person running the establishment have the power to award additional days to the prisoner? What concerns me about this is the first thing is it's not dealt with in public at all, it's dealt with in private. And secondly, why should it be that I have the power, or indeed any of my colleagues, to award up to 42 additional days imprisonment for any breach of a prison rule which extends the prisoner's sentence? And perhaps this is a subject that's perhaps known to some of the people in the room today. Perhaps it's not known to any of the people in the room today. But if it isn't, it certainly should be, because it strikes me that this is quite the wrong way of dealing with people who breach prison rules and who perhaps might or might not deserve an additional award of time spent on their sentence. And I wonder what your thoughts were about that.
Thank you, Adrian, very much. Can I just ask you, is that rule there as a disincentive to take the cases? Is it a calculated effort to inhibit prisoners from taking cases to you, that they could end up with a longer sentence?
I have absolutely no choice, Professor, about what I get sent to me. It's entirely up to the governor. The prison rules are such that when the governor has a certain discretion about what they can deal with, for example, if they find that somebody has breached a rule, they can, for example, remove their privileges, so take the television out of their cell. They can stop them having canteen with their fellow prisoners. But if they don't want to do any of that and they think additional days have to be added, the prison rules, which come about by way of a statutory instrument, are that once it's referred to an independent adjudicator, such as myself, I can't refer it back. Yeah. So even if I think that the governor's gone completely over the top, I can't do anything about it. Yeah. I have all the powers of the governor, but the power to award additional days.
Very interesting. I suppose what I think in reply to that here, and thank you very much for your earlier remarks too. The book was with Keith, who was at King's with me, and I think it shows us that writing the letter that you wrote today with the Howard League is really an important part of this process. Never ever rest on laurels. Always drive to the next thing, because advancing the situation of people who are on the margins is constantly in need of reworking to grab the wins and move for more. And therefore, I think it's important to push hard in calculated way to try and improve the lot of these individuals and to make sure the Court of Appeal's judgment is followed through. So a combination of civil society activism and shrewd litigation. Shrewd litigation is, I think, as we've seen with the Court of Appeal case, possible in your field more than perhaps in some others, actually, more than in the field of maybe social rights in the context of austerity. but avail of the new vogue for common law rights too, drawing on what I earlier discussed. Because as you may know, the United Kingdom Supreme Court has been preparing the day for the repeal of the Human Rights Act by developing new ideas about common law rights. And they are new, they pretend they're old, but they're new. And so what you've just described is the kind of thing that might appeal to a common law judge. And it's sensible to present arguments to try and push the improvement of prisoners in both human rights and common law terms, I think.
Any other questions? Yeah.
My name is Callum. I'm a former PAS volunteer.
Did you say Callum?
Sorry, Callum, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
I just kind of wanted to ask about legal aid, if I can. I entirely agree with your point that Labour really needs to embrace and champion human rights if it's going to form a government and in opposition as well. But I guess I'm curious to ask that, as controversial as LASPO was, and as damaging as it has been, the severe cuts to legal aid, it was interesting that the Bark report commissioned by Labour didn't exactly suggest reversing LASPO entirely, but only sort of lessening its effects in some ways. I'm wondering what you think the future of legal aid is, were Labour to form a government perhaps in the next decade or so. Yeah,
I'm not a specialist in what the Labour position is, so I'll answer slightly more generally. There was a very dramatic period in the mid-1990s where Labour flagged up a dramatic change. It was when Jack Straw refused to oppose Criminal Justice and Public Order Bill then before Parliament, and when Tony Blair, as Shadow Home Minister, accepted some parts of the terrorism law. And these were big shifts because they showed that the party was moving in a certain direction towards what became known as kind of third way. And what is important, and I think is now more feasible than at any time since then, is for Labour to plausibly assert a similar shift in the opposite direction. And that could be in the field of legal aid, but I doubt it will be. That has been partly in the field of student loans, but I doubt that it will be in the end. But what we need is for Labour to be able to shift all of opinion in the direction of accepting the importance of legal aid. And so it could be a galvanizer for culture. But it would take quite a level in the current political climate of political confidence to do that, because it remains one in which they are exposed to the press. But I think the right-wing press is much less powerful than people thought it was. And I think the last general election showed that. And so times are not bad from the point of view of a dramatic shift, analogous to, but the opposite of the one that took place in the mid-1990s. And I would hope Labour will be thinking strategically and will choose to fight some battles as a way of changing public opinion. I think it's going to be hard to persuade them to do it as legal aid, but they might be able to. They might be able to. I've wondered about a national legal aid service myself, like the National Health Service, but I'm always told that that's a naive position.
Yes.
Hi there. My name's Jane Dodd from Herbert Smith Freehills. I just wanted to say that you mentioned the student debt thing, which, to my point of view, I think Jeremy Corbyn was very misleading about student debt and, in a way, misled the populace into voting for him on that topic in particular. So I would like to know, do you really think you can trust Jeremy Corbyn with your agenda that we've been talking about this evening?
Yeah, I think student debt one, I don't really follow it, except I think there must be some property issues, I don't know, or renationalisation of this or engagement of that. It was certainly a dramatic intervention in a number of seats that secured huge votes. I agree. And I think there was a certain degree of calculated confusion about the interventions from Jeremy Corbyn himself. I think what we need to establish within civil society and among those who are members of the Labour Party, an understanding of a certain approach to society, to make that society better in a fair way, which make Jeremy Corbyn not a mouthpiece of such a shift, but somebody who finds it very comfortable to reflect that shift. So I slightly resile from the personalisation of it that you've suggested, that we need to back or form a view of the trust we have in Jeremy Corbyn. What I would like to see emerge in the next year or two, and I think actually it's happening with Emily Thornberry, absolutely brilliant today in the House of Commons, and with Keir Starmer in the Brexit thing, is we need to recover what was the case in the 1960s, well before my time, I'm relieved to say, a sense of excitement about the quality of a front bench team. And we're a little away from that, and I hope that there is the potential for that, so that it becomes less about whether we trust Jeremy Corbyn and more about whether we feel that the Labour manifesto for government is one that has a real buy-in in civil society. I have myself historical anxieties about Mr Corbyn, not least in the context of the country from which I come, the Republic of Ireland. But it's a salutary fact that that anxiety that I have is now in the memory of huge numbers of the electorate so completely distant as not to be something that matters or concerns them at all, and perhaps it shouldn't concern me.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, my name's Hannah Uglow from the Kent Law Clinic at the University of Kent. Thank you for your lecture. It was completely gripping. But one of the concepts that I was interested in is your discussion of I've had wine. Complementarity.
Sorry, no, I'm saying the left. You're going to have to work at telling me what it is.
Let's try again, am I? Okay. Complementarity. Did I get that? Yeah? We're winning.
Thank you.
Because in the darkest, I'm a relative newcomer to prison law, and in the darkest scenario where we have the repeal of the Human Rights Act and we are reverting to a common law culture, I wonder what your outlook is about the ability of the common law to move forward post the Human Rights Act and to incorporate the jurisprudence of Strasbourg within it as it moves forward, essentially. I hope that makes sense.
It does, and I'm really, really pleased that you chose to compliment me so straightforwardly.
You're very welcome.
Or was it complementarity?
It was definitely complementarity.
I wrote a number of articles and books that were very critical of the common law, and I'm certainly dubious. I've written a book just last year called On Fantasy Island, where there's a chapter in it about this myth of the common law, that it is this historic commitment to liberty and freedom, and that it's part of the fantasy that Britain persuades itself is the case, that there was this wonderful common law, etc. So I absolutely am sceptical about its foundations. But in a world which is not your ideal world, you grab what you can. And what you try and do is you try and take, in my opinion, you try and take this idea of the common law's rights, which has become much flagged in the last 3 years in the Supreme Court, cases like Kennedy and Charity Commissioners and many others, and Rhodes. And you try and make it do the work that you want it to do. So that's why prisons is not a bad case study, because even quite reactionary judges who might really balk at striking down the bedroom tax can see that part of the tradition of British law is access to justice. So you try and work this space in a way that produces beneficial outcomes for the kinds of people in whom you're interested. And you draw in the international community as a way of insisting that what the courts should do is something which fits with the common sense of judiciaries generally, rather than is out on a limb. So I am extremely instrumental about the common law, and relatively upbeat that there is a kind of culture of commitment to fairness among even the more elite elements of the bar, which I don't think was there 20 or 30 years ago. I think partly the human rights language has infiltrated this culture in a way that has produced an assumption about fair play that is more realistic than it used to be. Now, I may be wrong, and it may be just that I'm getting old and forgetting my sceptical past, but I would try and build on that now rather than write it all off. But, Hannah, I mean, remains to be seen. We're only as good as the bench we have. And let's see what happens when the next generation come in.
So we take the opportunity to thank you very much, Conor, for a fantastic presentation. And Martine.
Thank you very much.
And Martine will come up and thank you personally.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I'm not lying, I promise. For feeding us this fantastic mix of anger, outrage, laughter, and hope. And I think this is such a fantastic fuel for action. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martine. Thank you very much.
Really, thank you. We also want to thank Mayor Brown, and I know this environment is not really familiar to most of us. It's strange to where we are generally operating, but it is very generous of them to offer us that space and these facilities, which means really, obviously we want to thank all of you for being here, and we are aware that many of you here, individuals, corporates, trust, have supported PAS during this year and before in many ways, financial and otherwise. And I hope you don't mind if we ask you to spread the word, to spread information about the good work that PAS is doing, and speak to people whom you think, may have an affinity with our cause, with the work we do, like our Facebook, read our tweets. This is all, I'm too old for that, but I'm sure it means something to most of you. Retweet our tweets, just spread the work. And I feel that because things are just so atrociously bad in prisons at the moment, this sort of, public opinion hears it on the news. So I think in a way, because it's so bad, it's sort of propitious time to spread the work and look at this remarkable, these toolkits for me, they mean so much at a time when the profession is structured financially, that people learn to help themselves and help others, and this is one of the great missions of PAS. And that means thanking PAS team. It's only 10 people and only one full-time. And they are all here today. Ben, Jeff, Buffy, Anna, Laura, and Deborah, Nikki, of course. Nikki. What Nikki doesn't know about prison law and prisoners is just not worth knowing. And Eric Allison knows that. And of course, Lubia and Deborah, who in addition to casework, litigation, promoting the word, do the management, the everyday management of this organization. So thank you massively to you.